Right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. I hope everyone can hear me all right. I'm Rob May, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the Managing Director of Ramsac. Listen, when we booked this, when we scheduled this session, it was long before we knew about coronavirus. We we set this last year, and we said that we should do a session on business continuity. And I've sat down and I have tweaked some of the slides, but I sat down with a view of, do I rewrite this specific to coronavirus? And I've actually come to the conclusion that that's not the thing to do. What I'm going to do is take you through the the original presentation that I planned on giving to you about business continuity. And in doing it, what I've realized, and in going through the slides, what I've realized is it's forced me to ask some additional questions pertinent to the environment that we now find ourselves in with coronavirus. So I hope that helps. This isn't all going to be coronavirus. This is going to be about how do we keep our businesses going, whether it's right now or whether it's in the future. So let's, without further ado, let's crack on. One of the things that I think's been interesting and conversations that I've been having with people, it's become apparent that still quite a lot of people don't have disaster recovery or business continuity plans. And I think this Dilbert cartoon sums that up. But it's perhaps cliched, but that whole thing about if you fail to plan, you plan to fail is very true. Noah didn't start to build his ark once it was raining, and there's a number of threats that could impact our business that we need to plan for. And as I said, as we talk through the ramifications of some of these, it will prompt thoughts that we can then talk about in the Q&A. So what goes wrong typically? Well, we have problems with systems, with our IT, with our software. And again, right now, many of you will be dialing in remotely for the first time. And do your line of business applications scale, and do they work properly in this remote access environment that we find ourselves in? So the systems, how do we scale that? How do we license that? How do we have bandwidth? What happens if your main line of business application were to fail? And what happens if your main line of business application were to fail tomorrow? What does that mean to you? Then we have infrastructure. So this is your physical IT, your hardware, your cabling, and so on. And again, we've got further considerations here, because many of you will be closing your offices if you haven't already. And we've made provision to enable a lot of our clients to work remotely. But what happens if then your core infrastructure fails? And what's your plan around that? And what's your plan around access, perhaps? Or maybe it's more fundamental than that. What would happen if there was a major power cut, or in wherever your IT is hosted, that kind of thing. So we need to think about, how do we plan and how do we recover if our infrastructure is compromised? And then, of course, we have probably the toughest one, and perhaps the most common one, but that's people. And what happens when people make mistakes? Human error is unfortunately very, very common, and we need to think about that. And then there's natural disaster, flooding, snow. We had it in our offices a few years ago. We had big floods. The canal, which is just by our office, flooded, and the car park filled. And what's the impact of that? And cyber attacks. I mean, this is one of my personal favorite subjects, and I do an awful lot of talking about cybersecurity. For many people, cyber attacks are perhaps on a normal day-to-day basis their biggest risk. And yet many business continuity plans and DR plans that I look at don't actually have a focus around cyber. Many of them are saying, well, what happens if we have a fire or a flood? And God willing, you're far more likely to have a cyber attack than you are a fire or a flood. So how does your plan deal with that? And what I will say is that with remote working and the remote working that we're having to do right now, there's definite increased pressure on cyber attacks. Unfortunately, we're seeing a massive increase over the last couple of weeks. There's all sorts of scams. There's fake outbreak maps that we're seeing on social media where you can click to see whether how many cases there are in your locality. A lot of them are cyber attacks, and you just need to be really aware of what you're clicking on and what you're working with. And then, of course, we've got the pandemic. This is something that's front of everyone's mind right now. And it's a really good test. It's a really good test of your plan. So assuming you have got plans, hopefully this is a good test. What I would say is that I'm conscious, and I've had conversations with various businesses over the last few days where people are reacting. There's a certain amount of panic in some quarters. People are reacting, but they're not going back to their plans that they've created. And the whole thing about doing a planning process is you do it in the cold light of day and you think through these things. So let me just prompt you, if you haven't yet done so and you do have a business continuity plan, go back to it now and take a look at it now and just see whether there's anything that perhaps you've not thought of yet, which is appropriate and that you've already come up with that you can apply to your coronavirus contingency. So what should the plan say? I suppose what I should say is there's two types of plans. There's a business continuity plan and there's a disaster recovery plan. And a business continuity is how do we keep things going and how do we react when we're in a scenario like we are now. And then we have a disaster recovery plan, which is typically a far more serious disaster. When I look at a plan, what I like to see is this clear? And does it make sense to anyone who picks it up? Your sanity check shouldn't be to get the person who wrote the plan to review it and update it. You need to give it to someone who's never seen it before. And is it clear what needs to be done, by whom, and when? This isn't rocket science, but this is often missing. That you often get pages and pages of detail, but people pick it up and they don't know when they need to start actioning it. And I think the other thing that's worth thinking about are key functions. What are the key things that you as a business deliver to your clients? And right now, what do you need to be delivering? Because it could be that, look, you're contracted, you've got to deliver some of this stuff to your clients, and if you don't, then that's going to cause you issues. But there's not everything that you do, and there's not everything that everybody in your business does that has to meet certain service level agreements or whatever. So think about the key role, certainly in the short term, in terms of what's a must and have we got plans in place for those, and start with those key functions. I usually give the example thinking about accountants. So, and this stemmed, I was working with a firm of accountants a number of years ago now, just talking about their planning. And I asked them what their recovery time was. And they, and in aspect of how long could you cope without IT? Now, don't get me wrong, IT is not the only part of business continuity planning. But I was asking about IT and I said, how long can you cope without IT? Now, given that we had provisioned for them 100% bomb-proof always up email, and that's easy to do. They said, well, given that all staff have got email, we reckon we could probably last 4 to 5 days without IT. And this was a real surprise to me. And I said, okay, okay. And then I said, a couple of questions. Do you run a payroll department? And they said, yeah, we do. We run payroll for our clients. And I said, I thought you did. I said, because if you were doing my payroll and you'd got no IT for 5 days, but it was my payday, I'd have an issue with that. You know, pay has to be paid on payday. And then I said, what about tax? You know, do you have a tax department? And they said, yeah, absolutely, we've got a tax department. So I said, so think about it. If you had no IT in the last week of January, what would that mean to your business? 80% of billings done in January in a tax department. And I went, no, you're absolutely right. And I use that as an illustration to say that, you know, it's not necessarily one size fits all. You might need to think about different roles, different functions and different departments and make different provision for them accordingly. Then you've got to think about your data recovery. As an industry, we used to talk about backup, and it's not the discussion should not be backup. Your discussion should be about recovery. And how do you get your data back if you need to go back to backup? And the reason that the conversation needs to move to recovery is it's not that long ago that backup was quite straightforward. If people were doing backup, they were typically using tape, and recovery was really fast and all encompassing. What we've got now is many people have moved their backup to the cloud, and that's not a problem in itself. But there are different types of cloud backup, and you need to be clear, what cloud backup have you got? Is your backup really, is your cloud backup really designed for documents rather than entire system? There's another question from a GDPR perspective in terms of where is that data, and some of these really cheap cloud backup systems, your data is being backed up in another country where it really shouldn't be from a GDPR perspective. But you need to know, if this all went wrong and if your systems went down, how long would it take your IT provider, your IT manager or whomever, how long would it take them to recover you? And is that appropriate for your business? Think about email access. I've already mentioned, I mean, most of our clients would use Mimecast or Office 365, probably Office 365 in conjunction with Mimecast. So people have got the ability to have always on email access. But does everybody in your business know how to use it? Literally everybody in your business. And we're seeing this tested right now where you've got people, I've no doubt that you've always had a number of people who have done some remote working. What we're now faced with is everybody doing remote working, and you've got people at every different job level. And do they know how this works? Do they understand all the different ways in which they can communicate and access their systems, whether that's on their computer or their phone or their tablet or whatever? So documentation and sharing that with people is really important, and doing it once isn't good enough, and having a policy isn't necessarily good enough if people can't remember where it is. You know, many of you who have heard me talk before know that one of my favorite sayings comes from a study that Harvard did that said that an intelligent person needs to hear something 6 times before they get it. And this is true with all the information we're communicating. And think about that right now, because certain people are in various states of worry and panic, and if you've just sent out an email or a message to say, well, this is what you need to be doing, don't think that you've just done it and people now get it. We need to keep repeating the messaging around this, because people need to hear it more than once, in fact on average 6 times. Think about manual options. Is there anything that you do? Is there anything that you provide to your clients that you currently rely on technology for that actually you could do manually in the case of a power failure? You know, our phones run for a lot longer than our PCs, for example, in terms of power protection. So if we were to lose power in the head office, the computers would go down before our phones. So on the basis that we were in the office, then we would have you know, all our help desk guys have got manual systems in their drawers so that they can continue to log calls, and then we can update our technology systems afterwards. So think about manual things, manual steps that you could put in place that you might need to protect yourself and ensure that you can continue to deliver the service that you need to deliver. Now, assuming you've got an existing plan, you need to continue to review it. You know, if people are named in your plan, are they still the right people? Have people's roles changed? Perhaps the people have changed. Perhaps some of the people named in your plan don't work for you anymore. So review that plan and think about in responding to an issue, think about roles rather than thinking about named people. Think about roles and think about cascading responsibilities. So don't rely on, you know, one person. Don't rely on your IT manager taking control, because, you know, she might be on holiday when your disaster strikes, or heaven forbid she could have been in the center of the explosion if your disaster is an explosion. So think about, well, who would be the logical role to take this, and then if that person's not there, then who would that cascade to? And if that person's not there, who would that cascade to? Think about your plan from that perspective. Think too about your website. Your website probably isn't hosted on site. It may well not even be provided by you. It could be a third party that looks after your website. One big question is your website transactional? You know, are people using your website to place orders? If that's the case, what's the backup plan to that? You know, and what business continuity plan have your website providers got in place? The other thing that you might want to think about is having some pre-prepared web pages that go live in the case of a disaster. You know, if there's a national problem, then companies might be really swamped. You know, we've seen a massive increase in support calls in this last week, where people need help doing things that they don't normally do. Web companies are going to be the same. But so it might be good to have some pre-prepared web pages with messaging that you've got in the arsenal ready to use should that become necessary. And then when you've got a plan, it needs to be tested. Every time I've been involved in testing a plan, whether it's our own or whether it's helping clients with work and desktop testing scenarios and so on, every time we do it, the plan changes. And it changes because people change, it changes because processes and systems change, but it also changes because technology does. And, you know, a response that you wrote 12 months ago could now be far easier by using different technology or different processes. So you need to make sure that you have a regular recurring plan of testing. Now, ideally, you need to be physically testing the plan. You need to be pulling plugs and seeing what happens. But as a very minimum, you should be running desktop tests. And I think risk management is really important. You know, any board of directors should have a risk register. A risk register details what could go wrong, what's the likelihood of it going wrong, and what's the impact. Is that high, medium, or low? And once you've got your risk register, you then need to plan against that. With all risks, you can either choose to accept the risk, to transfer outsource, reduce, or eliminate it. But you must consider what could go wrong, and you need to consider as a business what's your appetite for that risk, and what are you going to do to respond. And think about power needs. You know, if you've got computers in the office or even at home, you know, more of us are working at home now, what needs to be protected and for how long? You can have whatever power protection you want, and you can have however long you want. There's just a price that's linked to it. You know, power protection is about battery backup, but you should also know, if you've got servers, if you've still got servers on premise, and most of you will have some servers still on premise, how long does it take to safely shut those down? And does the UPS is an uninterruptible power supply, does the UPS give enough time to allow that? If you're running on a desktop, you might want battery backup. You can get very cheap battery backups, which means if you have a power cut, you can continue to use that machine. Laptops, of course, have their own internal batteries, but you can apply that same technology to your desktop if needs be. Then I think you need to agree and be clear, who are your media spokespeople? And that's so that staff know that they don't talk to the press. You know, if you've got a disaster, if something horrendous happens, the press will hear about this very quickly, and news travels so fast in today's age because of social media, and then the press come and they want to talk, and your team need to know, if we have that disaster, who is it that should be talking to the press? You know, and if it's not that person, again, think about cascading deputies so that it's, look, I can't help you, but you need to talk to X. I talked about the who, what, and when. One of the most useful things I've seen in any plan is a thought through list of first hour actions. It's incredibly useful to think about this. So when something goes wrong, when do we do it? What should we have done by now? And again, when these disasters happen in reality, people do go into a state of fluster, and you need to make it clear and think about where your plan is as well. You know, think about how easy it is to access, how easy is it to access digitally, how easy is it to access remotely. But in it, what do people need to do first? What are the priorities? Who do they need to notify? What are the things that they need to invoke? And just think through the different scenarios that you're planning for. Think through those first hour actions, and that just helps ensure that the important stuff gets done and gets done timely. And then think about how you're going to communicate with staff. You know, what would happen if your building were to burn down? How would you easily let everyone know? What's your plan right now with coronavirus in terms of communicating? And can you communicate with everybody? You know, is it email? Is it WhatsApp? Is it text messaging? We use a text broadcast solution, something like Text Local. Text Local is free to configure, it's free to set up, and you just pay when you broadcast text messages. But to that end, have you got everybody's contact details? You know, do you know how to contact with everybody that works with you? And do you know that that information is up to date, that it's current? And being morbid for a minute, have you got their next of kin details? You need to make provision for this. But just a word of caution, you need to make provision for this from an HR perspective, and perhaps from a line manager perspective. But what you can't do is take all of this contact information and share it with your entire business, because then you're going to have a GDPR problem. So just think about who can access that information, where it is, and whether that's up to date. Not so appropriate for our coronavirus type scenario, but generally a business continuity plan should include office layouts, photographs help. In this chart here, you can see photographs of people and where they actually sit. It just helps people think about how to respond and how to plan. But also, some of the most user-friendly plans that I've seen have other photos in them, things like how to turn off your gas, how to turn off your electricity. Where's your stopcock? And that one normally gets people when hopefully you all know where your stopcock is at home, but do you know where your stopcock is in the office? If you've got a water problem, do you know how to turn the water off? And again, unfortunately, I've seen clients who have got flooding problems and they just don't know. In fact, we had one client and they did have a burst pipe and the water board said, well, you've got to turn the water off at the stopcock. And they didn't know where it was. And amazingly, they did eventually find it, and they found it by talking to their neighbours. But their own stopcock had actually been boxed in and tiled over, and they had to smash through tiles and break through the wood in order to find the stopcock and turn it off. So things like that are brilliant to have in your disaster recovery plan, and have photographs and have labels so that the person who picks up the plan, who might not be the person who would normally know about this, would have no doubt where to go and how to turn the gas off or how to turn the electricity off and so on. And then distribute your plan. Everybody in your business should be privy to your business continuity and your DR plan. Just think again about the HR consideration that I just said, but have people got it? Do they know how to access it, when to invoke it, and who to talk to? And please make sure that your plan's got proper provision for cyber response. Many of you will have heard me say that there are two types of business: those that have suffered a cyber attack and those that don't yet know they've suffered a cyber attack. And you will suffer at some point. You will suffer from cyber. I'm sorry, but that's the reality of a connected world. So do you have a cyber response plan? And again, I talk to people who do have a business continuity plan, but cyber's not in there. Well, GDPR made it law that you've got to have a cyber response plan. So you should have that page in your business continuity plan, and that's fantastic, but separate it out as well. We've got a cyber response plan that's up in the staff room. It's very clear for people to see so that when things go wrong, they know how to respond. And make sure you're doing cyber training. Again, GDPR mandated that all staff have to have cybersecurity training. And you need to minimize that risk. And if you've not done that, can I just say that whilst you've got staff working at home, it's a great opportunity to actually be deploying some of this digital cyber education, and we can talk about that offline if that's something that you need help and advice with. And then think about your insurance. Think about your insurance from all aspects. In terms of your disasters and so on, but definitely think about insurance from a cybersecurity point of view. So many people have business insurance, but it doesn't cover them from a cyber perspective. And cyber insurance is not expensive, and it pays out more than any other type of insurance claim. So make sure that you've got that. Check your policies and take action. It's a cliche, but if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And we've got those threats. And, a lot of these threats are front of mind right now because of the situation that we find ourselves in. And we're responding to those fine, but we don't know how long this new working environment is going to go on for. So keep reviewing, keep refining, keep thinking about well, how do we respond to this scenario? Let's document it. Let's look at what we've learned from this. You know, we review every time there's an incident. We do a www.ebi review. So www is what worked well. So we took our plan, we applied our plan, what worked well, and we list those things. And then we say EBI is even better if. How could it have been even smoother? And do that and continue to do that. I'm sure, like us, you know, you're meeting almost daily at the moment to look at our responses and what we're doing and how we're responding and what challenges are coming up. You know, take action and act now.